Hey everyone, welcome to Cooperant Learning. I'm Kyle Steery, your host, here for another exciting week of behavior analytic conversation. We've got a great guest today, a returning guest today, which is always exciting. I'm always happy to have those. But first, my partner in crime, I said I'd change your name every time. Dr. Pauly, Dr. Stephen Pauly, is that what?
There's one person at our company that calls me something along those lines, and only one.
I panicked.
So
It was last second. I didn't know.
Still recovering from getting back from Tampa Bay Beer Week over here, right, Kyle? We really tried to get him to get a face tattoo while we were there, but he wouldn't do it.
So real quick before we start, I am not a tattoo person. It was never my thing. And Steve got what looked like a very painful tattoo, and it further affirmed my belief that I will never do such a thing.
Yeah, they're all about the same unless you're hitting a bony spot. So
Gotcha. Well, my entire body, I think, is just skin and bones. So that would be well. It's good to see you. This would be a fun conversation about tattoos, but we are not talking about tattoos today.
Not today.
Not today. And there's our guest, our repeat guest. Like I said, Dr. Alison Cox is joining us again. Dr. Alison, how are you doing?
Well, just fine. I can echo the sentiment of Boney being very uncomfortable. Bringing us back to the tattoo. All is well here. We're looking at snow where I'm at. I think you guys are similar. Sad. We've got the 16 degrees.
Yeah.
So we've had just a dusting here, but just north of us got multiple feet over the last couple of days. So we got lucky right here.
Yeah. No, all that stuff. Staying warm. Waiting for spring.
Lots of angry children waking up and saying, it was 70 degrees yesterday. Why am I putting on my snow pants again? Dad, I put away the snow pants in the attic a little prematurely. We had to hustle back up there and get it out again.
and no visitors this time up in that attic.
No. Yeah. So last time was the great raccoon fiasco where they did lots of damage to my roof and siding. And Allison and Nazra were joining us on that day. We had to reschedule because I had to get them off my roof immediately because there was literally like siding crashing down as I walked out. The kids had to like cover their heads like a tornado.
I think you should just allowed them to join, hand over the podcast to them, let the raccoons take over.
The way, and I won't talk too long about it, but the way they just assume ownership of your property was very, very disturbing. It was kind of like, we live here now and you are like, I felt like paying them rent at some point. I was like, I know. It was weird. It was really weird, but they were safely and humanely relocated. So all is well in Raccoon World in Indiana. So
that's funny.
Well, Allison, you want to tell us a little bit, if anybody who didn't listen in last time you were here, we had a great conversation last time, just a little bit about yourself and kind of what you're doing up there.
Yeah, so I'm in Canada up here at Brock University. For those of you who are watching, if you're watching, I got my little Brock mug. And so I did a PhD in actually psychology. I have a PhD in psychology, but there was a specialization in behavior analysis. That's one province over for those American folks. That's one state, like a state. Not really.
We need that reminder.
So that's one over where it's very cold a lot of the year where I was living. And that was actually my dissertation project, was variations in behavior function, looking at the influence of medication. And so that publication or that dissertation turned into a publication many, many years later. As we know, that goes, it takes time. And then you're kind of burnt out from your research. You're like, I don't want to look at that project again. So it takes even more time. But that one was published in 2022 in Java, actually. So that was a nice little thing. And then I just kept the research going. So I did graduate in 2015. So that gives you a sense of how long it took me to publish that dissertation.
Just yesterday, right? Just yesterday.
Well, yeah. So I kept that line of research going, asking different questions. There's so many unknowns in that area. And the learners that we're supporting, be they adult, children, whatever, they don't have, a lot of times they don't have the capacity to say, hey, this med is making me feel pretty awful. And anybody who has loved ones who are, you know, neurotypical, who have a really robust communication, can probably attest to how much of a bit of an art psychiatry is as opposed to a science. There's a lot of this med didn't work for me. Let's try a different brand. This amount didn't work for me, even though it's technically supposed to be therapeutic. And when you're dealing with a couple of medications at a time, that I think that dialogue becomes even more important. And for the learners who don't have, even those who have a relatively good communication method for more simplistic interactions, you do really need a complex set of language skills, a complex set of language skills to really make your needs known in the context of psychiatry. And so the impetus for this work was really came from the job that I was as a master's level clinician. And we had a great psychiatrist. She was scary, but she was amazing. And she actually only took on the role of a consulting psychiatrist because her deal with the agency that I was working for was that if you don't have behavior analysts on staff, I won't consult to you. So they hired their first behavior analyst because she said, I need data, I need information about how this is going to play out for the learners, for the adults. It was an adult dual diagnosis, residential and residential mostly. Anyway, so that kind of got me started on this topic. So I kind of had an idea before I even applied to the programs on what I wanted to do my dissertation on, and it was this topic. So
I'll say I was 2016 and I'm still planning on writing up my master's thesis on matching loss. So you're just on time as far as I can tell. You're doing just fine. I find that with the medications is also very interesting. We work with a lot of adults who are verbal, and we still have a lot of those issues. And it's almost like going to the eye doctor and like, is this better? Is this better? Like you can't always tell.
Yeah.
Or when things are getting worse, it kind of snowballs for a while until you actually notice, oh no, things are much worse, and we didn't see it until now. And so I think that nonverbal just makes it that much more challenging as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I was able to kind of dive into some of the research you sent me, and just broadly kind of starting off here, how common is psychotropic medication among individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities?
Yeah, so that depends on who you ask. You'll see a range across the prevalence research, but there is a paper, a recent systematic review that collects all of that prevalence research by Song et al. In 2023. I can send you that so you can post it in show notes or whatever. And they're saying somewhere around 41% of adults with IDD, with intellectual disability, are being prescribed. I also have another paper in their study sample, folks. There was up to 70% of the folks in their study sample were on a medication. So it's highly likely even if you're working with children, the numbers are pretty staggering as well. But I know that you guys are particular around adults, so I kind of got those stats out. I didn't pull the kids' stats, but it is still quite staggering in terms of the number. So as a behavior analyst, and you're dealing with folks who struggle with challenging behavior, you're going to come across that.
Because we, not only with adults, but a lot of people with a psychiatric diagnosis, not necessarily, rather than maybe developmental disability diagnosis, that is almost the go-to always. They've almost been on every medication under the sun before they even come to us, because that's kind of the first line of treatment. So
yeah, and actually I'm glad you mentioned the psychiatric illness, because it's not that the meds are necessarily a bad thing. What happens is they're being prescribed off label because the learners are not diagnosed with a psychiatric condition, and they're still being prescribed a medication that is not meant for the purpose that it's being used for, which, like I said, it's not a terrible thing. The psychiatrist is just working within the context of their clinical judgment, and they're making decisions. And there's a lot of theory around how medications function. There's behavior analytic theory, and then there's drug theory on how they function. And so they're using that theory to guide their practice. And wouldn't it be great if we could do a little more research on the ground so that their decisions aren't necessarily theory driven and we're more research driven, because we have those answers, but really we don't at this point. But I think that's the other kind of thing that concerns me is the medications are being used off-label. They're not being used for the purpose that they were made for, and that makes data collection and systematic processes for monitoring even more important. In addition to that, there was a huge Canadian study in Ontario, that's the province we're in, done by the Centre for Addictions and Mental Health, a big institution in Toronto, and they had something like 20,000 participants. They looked at, it was adult participants, 30% of them who were so there were 40% who were identified-ish that they were taking psychotropic medications. Up to 30% of that 40% did not have a psychiatric diagnosis. And so they also talked about the fact that that was by Lunsky et al. In 2017. I can send that along as well. And they also talked about the fact that that was a problem because medication monitoring was largely absent. So not only are you using this medication off-label, you're also not monitoring its impact. And so you can't be certain that it's having the intended effect. And then, you go months and months on this medication and no one's really checking in as to whether or not it's doing what you hope it's going to do. So again, it's kind of like several different facets of elements that are kind of make a bit of a disaster when it comes to how do we know we're doing right by this client?
Would you be comfortable talking about a little bit about the psychotropic theories? Because from what I've learned, and I've only taken a few classes and read some papers on it, a lot of it came like from the idea of those medications that are affecting serotonin that were being used for seizures, and then seeing the effects on individuals who had a schizophrenia diagnosis, and it decreased those positive behaviors of those behavioral additions we wouldn't see in the general population. But then I've also seen studies since then that suggested there is no direct correlation between serotonin and the psychiatric diagnosis, or at least they haven't found it in some of these studies. And I just wasn't sure kind of what is the idea behind how they work, if we are seeing some progress with them, but it's not necessarily directed with or directly correlated to the serotonin.
Yeah, so neurotransmitters certainly play a role. Dopamine is something that tends to coincide with antipsychotics. Like antipsychotics are really kind of asserting their effects through that mechanism, but largely the mechanisms of action are still unknown. They do have information. They have some theories and ideas around neurotransmitters, how they're functioning. This notion of dopamine being differentially affected by antipsychotic medications is part of the reason why I thought it might be interesting to look at preference and preference stability, which is what we're doing in our lab currently, across medication conditions, because dopamine is associated with the reward pathways. And if you're liking something today, it's possible that pathway could be disrupted in some way with the addition of a medication. And so what you like today isn't necessarily what you like after that med change. So, and nobody has ever looked at that in applied behavioral pharmacology. Nobody. Except us. We just don't have publications yet. So I think it's important that people understand, and that's what I think I was talking about before when these decisions are made largely theory-based, based on things like that. How are these neurotransmitters being impacted? And because I think there's still a lot left to be discovered in that context, and I don't do that kind of research. I don't do that kind of like basic, like looking at those things at that level. Not because it's not important, just because I'm more interested in what it looks like on the ground. And if I can come up with a really robust way to identify through behavioral indicators that learners who are largely nonverbal, or even if they are verbal, like you said, it's still really hard to describe what's going down, how they're feeling. Then I feel like I'm doing, my part. When it comes to the behavior analytic theories, we're looking at things like, is medication a discriminative stimulus? That's a theory. Is medication a motivating operation? That's a theory. And then we got three of them. Conditional reinforcer. Could it be a conditional reinforcer? And those are the three kind of predominant theories around how is this medication asserting its effect? So for example, the example I sometimes give for the motivating operation, we try to capture that in functional analysis. So it's possible, and there is some, and I mean, there's information on either side from the very little research we do have supporting this notion and not supporting the notion that medications function as motivating operations. So the example is Zarconi. She had a great paper, a series of papers in the early 2000s, and I'm just writing it down because like it helps me think.
Fine.
He did an early paper, and what they uncovered was that they seemed to see a function-specific effect with the application of risperidone. And this was a really well-controlled study. As I understand, it was embedded in the context of a randomized clinical trial, I think. I don't think I'm providing misinformation, but I believe that it was done with a very large team, including, psychiatrists who were looking at the effects of risperidone. And so what they actually uncovered was folks who presented with escape, maintain, challenging behavior seemed to have differential outcomes compared to those who didn't. And they were suggesting that it's possible that the application of the medication decreased how terrible the instruction felt to that person, right? And so that they were talking about how those outcomes could provide some evidence that the application of the medication was functioning as a motivating operation. It was decreasing kind of how problematic that person felt that instructor was. At the same time, we don't always see that outcome. I haven't seen much in the way of conditional reinforcers. So my interpretation of this, to give this people a bit of a practical example, is, say I engage in attention, maintain, challenging behavior, and contingent on the presentation of the behavior, my staff run to the PRN closet, they grab a PRN and they present it to me with attention. And so it's possible that the medication itself takes on the properties of the attention. And so that's how it could be construed that, it's functioning as a conditioned reinforcer. The other thing that I've talked about at times to give people a bit of a practical example of how it could be functioning as a discriminative stimulus is around that same notion, that blister pack with the presentation could itself signal the availability of reinforcement or not, if it's been presented, with in that same scenario. So these are some simple examples of how these could be functioning, and we really have not teased it apart. But if you're kind of trying to conceptualize, how do I set up a systematic program or a systematic analysis or systematic monitoring system, how do I set that up? You could be thinking about some of these theories and have that guide the data that you're collecting.
I feel like you just opened the pathway for like 10 more dissertations. Like there's so many questions there.
I know.
It's wild. My mind's already blown.
It's very interesting that you're doing this work, because it's something that we've had to kind of infer over the years with our work. You hear people that are on medication for bipolar disorder or antipsychotic, where they're not usually thought of being drugs of abuse. And we assume, because people stop taking them when it's kind of contraindicated, that there might be an aversive side effect and they're actually going to be a non-preferred medication compared to something like Xanax or barbiturates, these other things that could be used for, or are more likely to be used for, abuse. If that's the PRN, someone says, oh, they have anxiety, that's why they're assaulting us whenever they're anxious, we give them the PRN. Now, we're very likely just reinforcing those precursor behaviors that get them that PRN to get the Xanax or whatever. And so it's cool that you're actually doing the work here that we've had to kind of make assumptions on over the years, because that's what we've been going off.
Yeah. And that actually, I think Kyle's got a question later about this destabilization thing. And I actually didn't even touch on the fact that the application of a medication has two effects, the intended effect and then the adverse side effect. And how do we know that an increase in challenging behavior on the presentation of a new medication isn't because of a side effect? I think about people who dry mouth. Now I've got this person who's engaging in tangible, maintained, challenging behavior they never have before. They're trying to drink from a toilet. They're trying to drink from a mud puddle, and they'll hurt you to get it. And you're like, oh, this med doesn't work. It's terrible. And it's like, actually, maybe the medication was applied to help with self-injury, and it's doing that. But then at the same time, the presentation of, but if you're not thinking about the possibility of these other facets, and that's a simple fix. If this med is doing, this is why I'm not like, oh, no meds. I'm just saying, let's be smart about their application. So if that self-injury has really come down with the application of this new med that's also coinciding with an increase in target, tangible, maintained, challenging behavior, maybe I'm giving somebody a little spritzer Maybe they sit by my side and all the time, non-contingent, just whenever you need a little spritz, have a little spritz, right? Because we do know that over drinking can be problematic for the body as well. And also drinking from a toilet and a thing and like, but that's a simple solution. And now you get the benefit of the therapeutic outcomes, which are decreased self-injury, and you're managing this tangible maintain. But if you're not thinking about those things, then you just kind of jump and react and take them off the med, and then the self-injury comes back. But now maybe they've gotten reinforced by this tangible. And so they're like, oh, that'll work elsewhere too, right? So if I hit you, I get a band ride. That's how that works now, right? So you don't know kind of, are you creating some more problems for this learner by being maybe too reactive and maybe sitting and thinking back a little bit like a detective of, okay, that's an interesting increase. Like that, what's happening here? We've never seen this from this learner before. Anyway.
Yeah, conversely, we often see where they've maxed out 3 or 4 different types of meds. You can't give any more. And now we're like, all right, let's start titrating off to see, where we're at because the target behavior is still occurring. And then we see an increase. Well, the withdrawal symptoms are aversive. We know aversive conditions are MO for aggression. And like, oh no, the medication was working. We have to put them back on immediately. And we're like, wait. Let's look through and see what's going on here.
Yeah. And also that comes to pass. We don't have a lot of really good objective ways to evaluate adverse side effects. Maria Valdivino said a great paper in 2017 where she basically manipulated the conditions of a functional analysis to evaluate the presence or absence of side effects. And that was one of the only papers I know that had tried to do this objectively. Otherwise, most of the time it's, are they presenting with X or Y? Like there's a lot of indirect measurement around adverse side effects. And those are really private events. And unless there's something bleeding or something swollen or something that I can see as an observer, I don't think I can do that justice in terms of monitoring that. So what I often recommend folks do with the adverse piece is talk to pharmacists are so untapped. They're the untapped resource. They are so smart. Okay. And so oftentimes you won't have the time to talk to a psychiatrist about the side effects. You could call up the pharmacist and that, because usually these folks have the same pharmacist because it's just so much easier to, get the scripts from the same place and say, okay, what side effects do I really need to be looking out for? And they'll give you the most common, and then you can kind of consider from there, how am I going to potentially offset these? How can I make this learner more comfortable knowing they might have dry mouth, knowing they might have increased urine, presentation. So I'm reminding them to go to the bathroom more often so they're not having accidents, knowing they might be a little bit groggy. So maybe I'm putting them to bed a little bit early, but how much grogginess is too groggy? Because then that suggests it's over sedation. But having a couple of pieces of information about what should we be on the lookout most, and then putting an evaluation system around that, ideally before the medication change occurs, then that can be another way to make these meds do or be as, get as much out of them as we can.
It's an interesting point and trying to figure out even a way to evaluate whether there's withdrawal or side effect when they don't expect it to be as well.
Yep.
I never mind putting myself out there. As a teenager, I got in a lot of trouble. And they said, oh, you have an anxiety disorder. Here's some medication. Not thinking maybe the anxiety was caused by all the trouble I was in, And coming off the medication, the psychiatrist was like, oh, this has no side effects. There's no withdrawal symptom. I'm like, well, I feel, that feeling when you're falling asleep, like you're falling and you jerk awake. Like that's happening every 15, 20 seconds, but I'm sure that's not the meds I'm coming off of. So it must just be me. You know what I mean? And they just said, no, there is no withdrawal symptoms because they didn't know. And so finding a way to evaluate that would be very cool.
Yeah, the ones that you're not expecting. I do think, it's like shooting darts in the dark if you're just starting from nowhere. So that is sort of why I recommend talking to the pharmacist about what should I be looking for, because not often, but it is possible that if you're putting a systematic approach into place, through that very careful observation, you might start to notice these unexpected things happening, right? Side effects. Actually, there was, again, Maria, she's my jam. She's great. I should have had her on with me. Anyway, she did something in 2005 and they were evaluating. So tardive dyskinesia is like a movement disorder that is often presented alongside antipsychotic medications, more so the typical antipsychotics as opposed to the atypical. That doesn't seem to be as profound in the profile of the atypical, the newer ones. But still, so so they had a learner who presented with tardive dyskinesia, and they conducted a series of functional analysis, and they were inquiring whether there was any socially mediated behavior, right? If this was socially mediated. It wasn't, but what was really neat is they identified lower rates in the demand condition. And so what we can do as behavior analysts is present, because these behaviors are so annoying, right? If anybody's experienced them, trying to open a banana, you're shaking, your mouth is doing weird things that you're not telling it to do. And so if you can create periods of reprieve for that learner in their day, knowing that the presentation of an opportunity to engage in gross motor tasks decreases the frequency of these very unwanted behavior, that is still something, because you are purposely providing a bit of an oasis for them when it comes to, hey, I can't do anything about this. It's going to stick with you forever. Because sometimes when those side effects present themselves, if the learner's been on the med for a long time or nobody noticed until it was too late, taking them off the med actually makes the side effect worse. And so at least I can offer you every 15 minutes, a 5-minute reprieve, but you don't know that unless you evaluate it. So there's a lot of different ways that I think, and this is going into the one of the other questions that I think was in the list here, Kyle, was like,
Yeah, Steve doesn't read ahead.
What can we do? What can we do as behavior analysts to support? And I think this is a really great way, is being just really strategic and systematic about how we're assessing the intended effects, how we're assessing the adverse effects, how we might offer some reprieve across these various scenarios we've talked about to this point. And I think that adds value, because it can, improve overall quality of life, and maybe even give the drug a chance to do what the prescriber is hoping it will do.
And on that note, you made a point in one of your articles you sent me, and I forget which one, but the how the medication effectiveness is typically assessed. So, and then the risks of like subjective reports. So can you speak to that, especially when it comes to IDD populations, what those risks are? Because I feel like that's a really important point before going forward and diving deeper into some of the work.
Yeah. So generally in the psychiatric or the psychopharmacology research, they use something called the Aberrant Behavior Checklist. It is a standardized indirect measurement kind of ranking tool. And it's been used, it's been validated and all that jazz. So that is generally what they're using. The issue I have with using that is in the context of unblindedness, which is, let's face it, like that's what we do. Like, we're not blind to the client's medication changes. The staff have to know, because they have to make sure that they're getting the prescriptions that the doc has said. And so because of that, there's really no way to offset the bias that you are going to have. Like, some people like, this med's going to work. And so that's going to inform that ABC outcome, right? Someone might be like, no meds, all natural. And it's like, well, obviously that's going to impact. So I do think that an over-reliance on the indirect measure, if you even get that often, and you guys probably attest to this as well, when I've been part of a larger team, it's the psychiatrist saying to, hey, Sally, how did John do on his med changes this month? And Sally is a single staff member. Sometimes she's 3 to 1 in a home. She doesn't remember that the last episode was because John's mom canceled last minute, and so he didn't get to go home, and so he tore the roof down, and all she remembers is that he had a really hard time last week. And so she extrapolates from that and didn't remember that the 6 weeks before that he did beautifully. And so oh no, big problem, meds. And this is also why that original psychiatrist who kind of laid the groundwork for my interest in this topic was so reliant on data, because she knew that was inherent, and that was a big problem in the work that she had done, because she'd built a skill set around working with folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I've been in consults where the staff are like, we need more meds, it's terrible. And she's like, did you fill out Allison's data? And they're like, no. And they're like, she's like, come back when you have, bye.
Yeah.
And it was really great, because they started to do the data, which I think was helpful. But B, it really does send this message that we are our own worst, like eye observers. Like we're very bad at recall when we have a million things on the go, and it's been 7 months since the last appointment, or even 7 weeks since the last appointment. And we need to be really careful about how much stock we put in. Well, Sally says John's med changes were no good. Also, do we know this person? Sally might be brand new to the group home and she just happens to be working when the psychiatric consult is. I know some agencies do try not to do that, but that's another kind of variable that can really get in the way of true accurate reporting. This is the last thing I'll say on it because I'm going a bit tangential, but I had an advisor have us do the quality of life. There's a quality of life measure. And I was learning on how to administer it because it was a standardized measure, this and that. And she said, I want you to fill it out for someone you know really well, someone you have known almost your whole life, like your mom, your sister, someone. And then I want you to have them complete it for themselves. And I want you to see how much agreement there is.
Interesting.
20% agreement.
Wow.
And these are people that, and that was the same across the board. That was the same across every trainee that was in that class. And so if I have trouble doing that for someone who's fully verbal and very, how could I possibly be talking, be really getting into the nitty gritty of how things are going without additional measures to augment what I'm experiencing as a support staff.
And especially for someone who may not be able to speak for themselves in those scenarios as well.
It always reminds me almost like the studies they've done with people are witnessing crime and acting as a witness in that. And I've always gone in for these functional assessments and, all right, oh, it's horrible. This happens all the time. They're always beating us up. I'm like, oh, well, think of the last instance. What happened? Oh, I have no idea. But in that stressful moment, in the heat of the moment, you're not stopping to think what's going on around me. It's just, how do I survive this? And so it makes a lot of sense.
As they should, they just got to get through it. But at the same time, that really does echo the need for something more structured when it's not do or die time, right? And you're actually putting, and also the reinforcement contingencies that exist throughout that learner's day are very different. If I can insert an FA, I know there's limitations because there's this idea that it's contrived. Okay, well, don't present instructions they're not going to see on a regular basis. Don't create conditions that don't exist in their life. If divided attention doesn't exist because they have a one-on-one staff, don't run that condition. I know even when there is a one-to-one staff, that doesn't always, so maybe run the attention anyway. But it's this notion of make it as functional, make the functional assessment as practical and functional as you can, because then you can control the reinforcement schedule, which is an FR1. And present, it doesn't even have to be, oh, I'm going to tear the ceiling down. That's what our research is. We do mild or moderate. We do agitation indicators. I am not waiting for him to break the toilet and smack me with it. That is not the behavior that I'm trying to evoke in the context of determining whether this med is having its intended effect, which is to usually, tackle that agitation. I'm looking for things like, for a furrowed brow, finger flicking, and withdrawn. Like I know withdrawal, the dead man's test, but that's why we add those other behaviors that you can observe. It's not the withdrawal behavior. I'm looking for, a 3 or 4 taps on the wall for an individual who can really make some damage, but he looks at me and he'll tap, tap, tap. I'm like, okay, that's all right. I'll take this instruction. I'll go over there. So there are really great ways that you could leverage this functional analysis technology without putting yourself at risk and putting the learner at risk. And we do that across several medication conditions in the context of the study that we've got. And we've got all the things in place where, idiosyncratic conditions, we create an individualized FA and we run that out. So.
Yeah, I think that's important for any BCBAs who aren't familiar with the FBA process to understand how much nuance there is to it. I remember being in class and Stephanie Peterson was discussing how the FA, the functional analysis, is really set up that almost anybody can run it, but to do a functional assessment, the whole process, and not use a functional analysis really takes that level of expertise to be able to find those nuanced things and recognize what's going on, because it just takes so much more learning to actually pick those things out. And so we end up rarely doing it because we're doing in situ testing. And we know that the literature suggests a contrived setting as much as an in situ, both can be very effective. And so we're not saying not to do the full FA, but oftentimes we can get those answers just by, changing some variables here and there on the fly without setting off a full explosion in a person and get the answers that we need on the roll. So.
And I think that that's where FA technology really has gone, is to target those more mild to moderate, because also, if you think about it, that's where people are largely trying to intervene. They're not, unless they can't help it, they're not waiting for the fireworks. They are waiting, they'll see some agitation, they'll see something, and they'll be responding in that. So if anything, bringing down the target behavior to which you respond to the level that is usually where the staff respond is actually more ecologically valid anyway. Yeah.
No, that's a great point. Any staff person who may be listening, cue us into those precursors. It's always good to know those ahead of time before going in and assessing behavior. I've been blind to those at times, and it's not a fun outcome. So, hey, I wanted to dive into some of your research here.
Yes.
Psychotropic medication adjustment patterns in treatment literature featuring persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and challenging behavior in the Journal of Developmental and Physical Disabilities by Stellato, Cox, Thilenathan, all in 2025.
Perfect.
Do you want to talk about the objective of this study?
Yeah. So we wanted to look at the participant and the study characteristics, the trends in that for the single case experimental design research, where psychotropic medication had been evaluated in the context of intellectual disability for the purpose of, addressing challenge behavior. We also wanted to look at effect size and across the medication adjustment types. So we talked about, actually, this is kind of something that is not atypical in the medical literature, but really not really talked about in psychiatry. And that's making this distinction between med augmentation and med augmentation, and then the other one will come to me. So
maximization.
Maximization. Thank you.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So
I read.
We pulled that language from some of the rheumatology research, where the viable treatment paths might include adding a new med versus increasing med that's already in that person's regimen. And they actually evaluate those strategies to see which one is more impactful. And that's missing from our work, which I think is a little bit not great, because we do deal with folks who have 4, 5, 6 psychotropic medications, and there is no evidence to suggest that regime will be effective. The literature that does exist on treatment for challenging behavior in this clinical population, first of all, it's only FDA approved for folks with autism, autistic individuals. I'll use that term interchangeably because there's different desires across that population. So FDA approved in certain pockets, so not even like under 6. Risperidone and aripiprazole are not FDA approved for agitation in autism. And then there's certain pockets of, up until adulthood. And at certain point, adulthood, there hasn't been enough research to demonstrate the efficacy for the treatment of agitation. Now, I say autistic because that this evidence, these are not FDA approved for individuals with intellectual disability. So not, in addition to that, we'll go for it. The research that does exist is monotherapy. We haven't looked at several medications at the same time. And so I think that was important for us as for this project, because it's very difficult to have group design work look at 4 psychotropic medications across 2, across groups. And like, it's hard to compile a group of folks who would present similarly enough and require that funky regime. And so I think single case experimental design is well suited to do that. And so that's why I was interested to look at that research. And also to start the conversation about augmentation versus maximization as potential things we need to look at. So under these conditions, should we be trying to titrate up? Under these conditions, should we be trying to add a new medication? I went off track there from the original question, but I think I answered.
No, it's okay.
Your questions in my little tangent.
Yeah, no, that was good. And just to differentiate, and let's see how well I read.
Yeah.
Maximization is increasing the dosage to the max recommended levels, correct?
Not to the max, it's just an increase. We
just an increase.
Didn't say that it had to go up to the max therapeutic, because that's going to be different, I guess. But just an medication increase of a med that exists in their regime. Yeah.
Okay. Versus augmentation, which is adding another medication.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Which would be very difficult to review, especially the effects of multiple medications at the same time, how long they've been on one versus the introduction of another, and all that stuff. And really interesting findings. You want to talk about kind of your findings overall? I seem to, and tell me if I'm wrong, a lot of times that medication adjustments didn't have effect on frequency of behavior, or it was
Yeah.
negligible.
That it was negligible. So the effect sizes were relatively small across the board. I believe med augmentation did coincide with a slightly larger effect size. And for those of you a couple of years out of your stats training, effect size is just measuring the magnitude of change of the intervention that the intervention had on the dependent variable, in this case, problem behavior. Yeah, so we are very tentative about that because I think only between 5 and 10% of the studies that were included in this actually had objective data for us to pull from. We did end up emailing a bunch of authors to see if they kept those in a treasure trove somewhere, but largely we were not met with any objective data. So I'm tentative about that, but the reason I think, and this is one of the other questions you had, a reason I think that's important is because it really does, again, echo this need to collect information about how things are going down, because we can't be certain it's going to have the intended effect. And I feel very uncomfortable if they're not going to get the therapeutic gains, I don't want to be supporting them being on that med, because they're getting all these side effects. Whether they're getting therapeutic benefits or not, they're going to be experiencing side effects in some manner. The liver has to process those meds for the rest of their life. And if it's not doing what we want it to do, as behavior analysts, if we apply an intervention and it's not decreasing or increasing the behavior, we pivot. Why would we not expect to be pivoting? I'm not saying get rid of the med. I'm saying, well, maybe get rid of the one you added because it didn't seem to have but pivot to something else. Because I'm very uncomfortable with leaving them on something that has no evidence or very little evidence. And the evidence that we do have suggests that there's going to be minimal gains. If I'm not seeing some really important changes for this person, we haven't hit the right program for them yet.
I think that's my biggest issue with a lot of the medication studies that are out there is the statistical significance versus therapeutic significance. You know what I mean? We can show that this effect size in this large group, but can we show that it's actually hitting the mark and improving someone's life to that extent when you're having those big group designs? And so I do see the specific need for the single subject designs in doing this type of research.
Yeah, and in addition to what you're saying, even the group design statistical significance stuff is underwhelming. We just don't have enough. And I don't know if it's because it's such a small percentage of the population. And so people, like, I have a really hard time getting grants for work like this. I don't know if it's because I kind of prioritize single case. I don't know if it's because it's such a small population of people. I have to compete against cancer research and AIDS research. And that's important, absolutely. But it's just like, I just don't know what the appetite is for this because it is such a small population. But I think if you put dollar amounts to how much these people are spending, because a lot of these folks, I guess in your situation would be on Medicaid, but a lot of these meds are because they're on ODSP, which is Ontario Disability, that funding mechanism pays for these medications for the rest of their life. And it's like, that's a big bill when you're talking about 2, 3, 4, 5 every day for the rest of their life. So I think that there's definitely, I don't know, maybe we just haven't explained it well enough. But I am very concerned about the lack of robust research. That was the 2023 paper that Naz and I actually did together. Then also just a general underwhelmedness of the research in terms of the outcomes and what the impact it's having.
With the larger group designs, I remember in classes, maybe undergrad, maybe it was in grad school, because I did take a couple classes on neuropsych and medications, but correct me if I'm wrong, weren't they doing a lot of those studies where they would give everybody placebo and then anybody that was effective for, remove them, and then again give randomly assigned placebo or active medication, and then we're still seeing maybe a lack of robustness in that statistical significance, but still it is showing some level of significance, and now we can kind of say this medication at least works for some people. Is
Yeah.
that
I mean, there are a couple that were really well done, and there are a few, but they're speaking to monotherapy, and it's a very select group of medications. So I'm not, like I said, the aripiprazole and the risperidone tend to be more robust in terms of the evidence that exists, but not in the context of 2 or 3 other medications in tandem. And then, yes, there were some really strong studies around that with regard to all of those things that you talked about, all those measures and, robust research being done. However, that isn't necessarily how it's working in practice, which is why I like kind of doing research from this lens, because this is how clinicians are practicing on the ground. And so how can we bridge research and practice so that we are, at least trying to answer this question about under what conditions for whom and, whatever. And that's where actually consecutive case controlled series work, CCCS, consecutive controlled case studies come into play. There was that paper by Hagopian in 2020. And I love that paper because the work that I do really can leverage those more flexible designs to really answer some of these questions that we have about for whom, under what circumstances is this going to be helpful.
Yeah, I think that it's really great, important research, because when we're out there doing the work we're doing, we're just saying, how about, can we please not make any changes? And we'll see how our behavior analytic interventions affect things. And then from there, we'll see what we need to do. But if we actually knew the likelihood of an effect of the medication, maybe you could work in tandem rather than just saying, hey, let's just not touch it for a little bit here.
That's actually one of Kyle's. That was one of your other questions. Is around like, what can we do in that context? And one of the things of like a psychiatric supports, I can't remember exactly where I'm looking for it right now, but and one of them is, hey, can we like do one thing at a time? If you can build a relationship with the prescribing practitioner, and some of them are very open because they're like, man, I'd like more information about how my changes are affecting this person. I want to do a good job. Most of them, I would say, are like that. Some of them, like any field, you're going to have some folks who, want to be an island, and okay. But maybe you can try to sell your wares really effectively. And one of the things I often tackle first is make one med change at a time. I will hold the BSP, behavior support plan, or whatever you call it, behavior intervention plan. People have different acronyms. I will hold that constant. I will not change anything. And then let's wait. Let me make my change. And then we'll, talk about this. Because the other thing that is a lesser known fact around some of these psychotropic medications, I believe it's clozapine, that they've done some basic research with, is that when you learn something in a drug state, you may not perform what you learned in a non-drug state. So I may have taught somebody functional communication in a drug state, and then everybody's doing well, and it's like, let's get rid of some of these meds because, we want to be as healthy as we can, et cetera, whatever reason. And all of a sudden that FCT response starts to, or the IFCR, I guess, functional communication response disappears. And you're like, oh, they like, you just like, oh, whatever. Maybe you don't akin it, but maybe if you knew that in advance, you do a couple trials in the new drug state, and then that behavior sustains. So like I said, that's extrapolation to the nth degree, because that type of information I've only ever uncovered while looking through basic research and non-human organisms. But I still think, again, it's another thing we need to be looking out for. We're presenting to present the learner with a scenario where they're going to be the most successful. And if we have to remind them or reteach things in different drug states, maybe that's something we have to do.
It's very interesting. I hadn't thought of it all, other than if there's a kind of a depressive type action on the medication, maybe we may not see the changes we expected to see, or it may not maintain. But I hadn't thought of different levels having differing effects, and maybe learning it without the medication wouldn't work once on medication, or vice versa. But I did have to smile when you said that. It reminded me, and Kyle, you can edit me if necessary, of the movie How High, if you've ever seen it, with Redman and Method Man. And they said, study high, take the test high, get high scores.
No, that is CE worthy right there. I wanted to touch on, as we're rounding out on an hour already, I can't believe this has gone by so quick. But your 2020 paper, demonstrating an analyses of clinical data, evaluating psychotropic medication reductions, and the Achieve program, Cox et al. 2020. Do you want to discuss? First of all, I'd never heard of the Achieve program. Do you want to discuss quickly what that was, what the goals of the Achieve program, and then what you did in that research paper?
Yes. So I cannot take credit for the Achieve program. That was Pritchard and his Bud Mace used to oversee that program. That's a great group in Wales. And we, because it was structured, we were able to do the analysis that we did. So I've got a little snippet here. The Achieve program, in a nutshell, is a structured behavioral intervention that uses positive reinforcement-based point and level system to promote student success in school or work environments by explicitly teaching and rewarding key pro-social and academic skills. It targets 5 core areas: academic, productivity, safety, social behavior, and individualized goals. And they're framed in terms of what the student should do, shouldn't do, should not do. It uses skill points as conditioned reinforcers earned through demonstrating the behaviors and, paired with praise and all that good stuff. So this was a residential school, or a school for children who were really struggling. Some of these folks were on trial for assault with a weapon, setting fires where somebody got injured, like some really hard to serve clients who had some level of intellectual disability, but that wasn't their primary kind of presenting issue. It was more around some other mental health, unstable housing. They've been kicked out of every foster home. Some folks who struggled. So anyway, that was the Achieve program. And then they also had a consulting psychiatrist who was supporting that facet of their care. And what we were, it was interesting. We met at an ABI conference, and they were like, we have a question. We have a clinical question, and we have hundreds of data points across, all these learners, because they take daily data. We did weekly there, but they take daily data. They had a behavior analyst overseeing all of it. So we didn't have IOA for this data, but the structure of how everything was implemented, because of the risk associated with these learners, I felt really comfortable. Like, I was able to successfully argue with the peer reviewer that it's okay. We didn't have IOA because we had oversight to this. And can you imagine being like, oh, I didn't take the right data, and this learner who's fully verbal, no IEP, and he's like, hey, I earned my movie stub this week. What the hell, man? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I think that the type of clients almost kept them honest and very accountable. So I made a bit of an argument there with the reviewers, which we won. But anyway, the point was, we were trying to find a way to retrospectively. So again, all of this is not, like you said, it's not in your paper or in your notes. It's not causation. It is correlation, but we found a way to use some fun, easy statistics to kind of tease apart what the impact of these different and concurrently applied interventions were having. So that's Achieve. That was the intention of the program. And we were specifically also interested in looking at the likelihood of problem behavior kind of spiking after a med decrease, because that was the biggest clinical question they had. They had I guess they might have had a new psychiatrist coming in who was a little bit more hesitant, was concerned about destabilization. To my mind personally, dude set a house on fire on 7 psychotropic medications. That's not working. That's not working. Right? And so, I would, in a setting where there's highly trained staff and a lot of oversight, I'm not a psychiatrist, I'm not a prescriber, but dude, that's not working.
Yeah.
Why are you worried?
Right.
It can't get any worse.
That's almost always our argument. It's like, we've done this for years. Now let's try our way and see what happens. But we'll work with you.
Exactly. So what we tried to do was create like a proxy baseline, and the proxy baseline we created for one of the analysis, there were 4 or 5 in there, was
Mhm.
that we looked at week 1, week 2, was there a med change, yes or no? If there wasn't, we went into this category, and then we looked at did the problem behavior increase or decrease like across that week, and that created our proxy baseline, and then we compared that to how often we were observing med increases or med decreases that coincided with a spike in problem behavior the week after so it was kind of a really interesting way to manipulate the information in a way that created a consumable bit of a piece, and that could have been used to talk to the psychiatrist. But look, like generally speaking, our trends would suggest we're not really concerned about destabilization because this is what and to be able, I think, to talk to psychiatry because of the way they're trained, they're largely group data people, is maybe a little bit easier to communicate that as opposed to trying to talk to them about individualized trends. And also when you're looking at hundreds of data points across months and months and months, it's like, how big is that time series graph? I was like, what can
Right.
you even deduce from that? So I think that these trends and those more subtle patterns can be exemplified by using statistics in a responsible way, right?
And you found that there wasn't a lot of concern for destabilization, right? Like there's some empirical data there, at least in this study, that that the reduction of medications wasn't necessarily correlated with an increase in behavior or that spiking of baseline conditions or anything like that.
That's right.
Also, interesting to me, and tell me if I'm interpreting this wrong, behavioral interventions were more closely linked to improvements in behavior than actual medication changes. Did I read that correctly? And what should we take away from that as far as going forward?
Yeah, so that tended to be the case. There are some like caveats, obviously. It's going to be individualized for the learner. And also there were criteria that the students would need to meet in order to shift into the next condition. So arbitrarily, you're already putting them at an advantage that the behavior intervention might impact the behavior in a different way than the med because there wasn't the same criteria for a med change. So for example, if you were saying, I'm going to make this med change, but I'm only going to do it contingent on X, you're putting yourself in a leveling the playing field, but that wasn't the case, which maybe it should be. Maybe we should say, if we don't see this happen by X week, we pivot. And I think that is something to take away because and this is something that I do in my meds training for behavior analysts. I help and coach behavior analysts on asking questions to the family. So because people feel like it's a silver bullet, and it's not. You cannot say, oh, we're going to go on meds, it's going to change everything. What do you want this medication to do? What does success mean to you? And I think helping families and caregivers communicate or be objective about take the edge off. What does that mean? Take the edge off. You want them to sit in their seat and do 15 minutes of work on task behavior. If that is your goal, because what you do by setting an objective goal, supporting people in setting objective goals, that goalpost doesn't move. When you say, oh, I want to take the edge off, you may have done that, but then it's not good enough because they want everything to go away. And I don't know of a medication that affects fecal smearing. Just saying.
Right.
So I think there's a couple of things to take away. Support, if you have that kind of a communication with your psychiatric team, support people in having objective expectations for these interventions. If they don't meet that threshold, shift, move on. Don't keep throwing it, oh, new one. No, this didn't work. We all agreed that we wanted to see X. We didn't see that. We need to move on. And the other thing another thing that you could do is help families ask those questions. And then it also, I think, by doing that, you are helping people be realistic about what they can expect from this medication, because we do often see different behaviors differentially affected. If you have self-injury and aggression, it's possible that the medication might differentially affect those topographies because maybe they serve a different function. And in that scenario, we need to be really mindful about what is our priority goal. If this person is almost going to blind themselves and we see a significant reduction in self-injury and aggression stays the same, as we have that hard and fast data, I might be okay with that to start, because at least they're not going to be blind. And then you work on the aggression, right? Maybe you do that behavior analytically, maybe you do it in another way, but the fact is you have hard and fast information to suggest this was our priority goal as a team, was the self-injury. We've got a handle on it. Now we need to set our sights on the aggression. And then that can actually, those sorts of set points can help structure, instead of everybody kind of throwing crap at a wall, seeing what sticks. That isn't the way to find the right intervention approach and to really take benefit from both of these forms of therapy.
Yeah, that was one really interesting finding, and I know we're over time, but I forget the other paper, but findings on how doing the continuous FA, showing how different levels of medication can affect topographies of behavior differently and even affect function of behaviors.
So that was the dissertation. That was a 2022 paper. And yes, we did see that.
Yes.
Different patterns of responding across in the same individual across different topographies. We didn't see as much function change across the medication conditions. So again, it's not like we know what we're going to see when a med is changed. And that kind of, again, echoes that need for structured assessment. We're actually doing that work right now in my lab. We're comparing, and we're going to present it in Prague this year. My students submitted to present there. But we are looking at PRN changes versus daily medication changes, and whether there's we're looking at effect sizes across those, but we're also looking at function change, because this is important for behavior analysts. If the application of a PRN changes the function of the behavior, your function-based intervention is no longer helpful. So you now need to have a BSP that is BSP when PRN has been applied, and BSP when PRN has not been applied. And people say, oh, that's impossible. No, there's some really good work by O'Reilly in 97 who looked at a child who was sleep deprived versus when they weren't. Their functional analysis came back undifferentiated when they didn't sleep. When they did sleep, their behavior was escape maintained. You cannot tell me that the application of a medication cannot possibly have the same kind of effect that sleep deprivation does, especially because half of these side effects are sleep related issues.
Restlessness. Yeah.
Right. So it's like, you can't presume that the function's not going to change. And wouldn't it be interesting? I mean, our preliminary outcomes are that, thank God, PRN doesn't tend to coincide with function changes as frequently as daily. And so function stability is still kind of paramount across these med changes. But what happens that you get the one case that it's not, and then your beautiful functional communication response or whatever you've done falls flat as soon as that person presents with the need for a PRN, or when the medication changes daily or otherwise. So we just don't have enough patterns for me to sit here and say, I'm comfortable. I did a PRN, or I did an FA several months ago, or I did, Steve, you were talking about doing little probes, right? I did a couple probes a couple months ago. We're good to go. And it's like, well, we also know nothing about function stability in the best of times. There's three papers, I think, on that. And the most recent one was by Bulmer and one of his students, and it was 2021 or something, maybe 2022. And then before that, there was some stuff in the 90s where they didn't that wasn't the primary purpose. But they were trying to look at function stability. So we've got all of these kind of confounds floating around, and then we're throwing meds into the mix, and we're expecting, I don't know what we're expecting, but the fact is we can't expect anything because we have no data to support it. So get some sort of systematic process in place so that you can actually be, true to your science and true to the expectations of a practitioner who's board certified, to be making evidence-based decisions.
I think it speaks to the importance of ongoing monitoring, and in going back to what we were talking about before in the adult world, there's so often that especially before we took over contracts, and Steve can speak to this a little better than I can, but before we took over contracts, our consumers were getting quarterly monitoring visits where for an hour they'd come in and just say, how's it going? And good, cool, check the box, leave, come back 4 months later, and the level of ongoing assessment, reevaluation, and that should be a kind of a call to action, I think, clinically for people in the practice, to continually going on. Even I think of how many times I hear after the fact, oh yeah, we changed meds like 2 months ago, and you're like, what? When did that happen? Nobody told
Yes.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're talking about 10 to 15 years ago, and it was just you put a plan as that's what you do, check on it quarterly, and don't actually expect to change any behavior. And
Yeah,
it wasn't
yeah.
usually behavior analysts doing it. And we came in, I'm like, I'm only doing this if we can actually try to effectively help these people change their behavior so they can have more autonomy and re-access the community again. There's still a lot of people out there, even in our field, unfortunately, just doing a fast, writing a behavior plan based on inadequate information, and then checking in quarterly. So
Yeah, and I know that's the case, and I understand that it is tricky. I'm saying do all these things with what time, but at the same time, you can be really intentional about who and when. So if you have a learner who's particularly struggling, because let's face it, you've got 35 people on your caseload, your catchment area is 400 kilometers. I don't know what that is in miles, and
I don't
it's
either.
yeah. And you're only one person, but if you have folks who are particularly struggling, maybe you're setting your sights on them. You're being really systematic about how you're now evaluating and monitoring. You're working with that team specifically, and some of the other folks, maybe their visits are spread out a little further. That's generally how I sell this approach to folks, because I do try to do research that's ecologically valid as well, in the sense that you could turn around, review my methodology or the procedures and run it out. You could, because I made it to try to be like, if a clinician, like a turnkey, as it were. And so I think I'm hopeful that people see that, they read it and they go, this is doable. I had a great meeting yesterday with another person in a different state. And she's like, yep, do that. And I was like, this is great. She's like, this protocol, I could totally run this, because I'm hoping that she'll collect data. She's a behavior analyst for the project. And she's like, yeah, I can run that. I was like, oh, I love you. Because sometimes, like you said, guys, you get into these situations, like I'm trying to branch out. I'm trying to also build capacity. I've done that where I've brought people into the project in different provinces, and they haven't never run an FA. And so I telehealth them through it. They're board certified, but they've never run one. So I telehealth them through it, and they build capacity, and then they become the lead. And then they train others in there. So it's, it's great for the guy who gets all this data, because the staff can use it. It's great for but there's also building capacity. And I know that is something that our field can really use, because with like just the number, how young our field is, and the number of BCBAs being pumped out every year, there are cracks. There's going to be cracks. So if we can fill those with research, then I think that's great as well.
Alison, I want to be mindful of your time here. Before we let you go, though, any plug for the research that your lab is doing now?
Yeah.
Any gaps in current research that you want to see? Go for it.
So I don't know if this is a thing, but I have a QR code to a survey study that we're doing, me being Maria Valdivinos, myself, Drake University and Brock. So if you could post that somewhere.
It will be in the show notes, 100%.
Love it. Yeah. So if folks want to, it's just a survey study. It'll take maybe 10 to 30 minutes, depending on how quickly you can move through it. And we want to get a sense of where people are at with this topic. With our project specifically, we're looking at preference stability. So we're running weekly preference assessments for learners who are part of our study. We have this project going across 3 provinces. So in your world, 3 states. And we're always looking for collaborators, folks who have an interest in, and they have, they're working with psychiatry, or even if they're working with community psychiatrists, as long as those med changes might be happening for the learners, that's something we're doing. So we don't know anything about preference stability. This is in short. We have limited information about function stability across medications. We have limited information about the effects, just in general, the frequency, the changes in that. And then we're also actually doing some really cool translational work. We're using log survivor plots to kind of model behavior across these medication conditions. And we're working with, hope he doesn't mind me saying this, John Michael Falligan. We're working with him to try to kind of look at the behavior from several different levels to see if maybe the reason we're not seeing some really stark patterns is because we're looking at the wrong level. And if we're a bit more precise and prescriptive about, or if we're a bit more precise in how we're collecting, because this is the last thing I'll say, rate presumes that the behavior is happening like a metronome, tick, 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 but that's not the case. You might have 3 minutes, or you might have most of the minute go by and behavior doesn't happen until the 50th second. And then it goes tick, 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 tick. And so when you interpret rate, you are presuming the behavior is happening at equal intervals across that minute, or whatever your denominator is. And what some of the research about bouts and pauses with that kind of translational stuff doesn't presume that. It breaks, it takes into consideration, what is the bout initiation? How long did it take? When a bout occurs, how many instances occur in that bout? And so I think there are so many different ways that we can use this information that potentially, again, we're looking through the wrong people. And maybe if we look through different people, we'll see a different story. So lots of good work going on.
We'll have to have you back when that research is done. But yeah, we'll definitely link those QR codes and of course all the literature that we spoke about today. And I feel like this could be a part 2. We barely
I had 5 more rabbit holes I wanted to go on. So
that doesn't surprise me. Well, I really appreciate the email, Kyle. I really like talking to you guys, and I like that that you're trying to get this information out of us. So thank you for doing the hard work, really.
Absolutely. Dr. Alison Cox, thanks for joining us to talk about meds. And this has been another episode of Cooperant Learning. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, you bet. Bye, guys.